So I've been pretty clear on this channel that the goal is to build a large investment portfolio, with the aim being that the returns of that portfolio will cover my household living expenses, and that will free up time for me to spend with family, friends, and pursuing hobbies that don't necessarily bring some money in. But I haven't actually spoken that much about how I'm going to achieve it, what I've done. So in this video, I just want to outline some of the roadmap for the future, some of my thinking. I'll also touch on a few things that I've done in the past, what I'm doing now, and what I plan on doing in the future. So first, I just want to talk about the £1 million goal. So why £1 million? So I mentioned it in a couple of videos, but it's not really a hard and fast target. There is some method in the madness for plucking that number out of what feels like thin air. Most of that method in the madness comes from a study conducted in the 1990s, and that looked at withdrawal rates from stock and bond portfolios and found that over typical retirement horizons, withdrawing 4% of the portfolio's first year value and then increasing that number every year in line with inflation and just ignoring stock market returns would mean that you won't run out of money pretty much in every 30-year time period. Now, we'll just say that I am aware of some of the flaws of this study, namely it focused on US data during a period of really massive US outperformance, and global versions of this study seem to suggest that actually trimming that withdrawal percentage by about 0.5% seems reasonable. There are also just some general disadvantages with this approach, full stop, and that's that actually most of the scenarios, if you're withdrawing 4% from the starting year, you end up with significantly more money than you started with at the end. And that's really not a very efficient solution, because that means you've saved a lot more money than you needed to, which means you might have worked longer than you needed to, or you might have cut back on experiences and things that you could have done when you were younger than you really actually needed to. Having said all that, it does give a good starting benchmark. So if I say 3k a month to withdraw from a portfolio, based on a 4% withdrawal rate, that's about 900 grand. And then factoring in some fudge factor for taxes, maybe that 0.5% for global diversification, it gives me about £1 million as a rough target to aim at. Now, the deeper we dive into that number, the more muddy you'll realize the water becomes. And here's just an example from that. So like many people, I have a mortgage on my house, and these numbers are sort of broadly right. I've not put the exact numbers in, but just put some rough numbers in. So you can see there's about 230k left on the mortgage, and that has a cost of about £17,000 per year to service that mortgage cost. And at a 4% withdrawal rate, that's £436,000 you need to cover that 230k mortgage, which is 200 grand more than actually just paying off the mortgage full stop. So you can see that from that perspective, it may be prudent if you had the lump sum to pay off the mortgage if you're relying on something like that 4% rule. Now, as you can imagine, there are thousands of permutations like this, whether it be changing your phone contract slightly or switching your utilities or anything that could shave off some money here and some money there. It has a big impact on your portfolio down the line because everything gets multiplied up by that 25 factor. So now that I've just kind of clarified that that target isn't hard and fast, how can I actually achieve it? Now, I do actually believe it's perfectly reasonable for anyone to become a millionaire in their lifetime. I'm sure some people maybe get a little bit annoyed at that statement, but I was reading an article on Reddit only this morning about someone who works on a minimum wage job at a supermarket, has done since they were 18 here in the UK, and they've been saving on average £450 per month since they started working, and they're now closing in on about 250k. I think they said it was about 18 years later, and so they're well on track to hit that £1 million total. So just to illustrate that, I've pulled up the compound interest calculator online, and you can see that if I plug in £500 per month, and do also just bear in mind that that £500 a month, that if you're working a job on the median salary and auto enrolled in your pension, paying in the very minimum, you're probably already putting £200 of that £500 you need away every month anyway, without really thinking about it. But after 45 years, if I assume that 5% real growth, and 5% is the long-running average for a globally diversified portfolio, I do actually see quite a lot of people that seem to suggest much higher numbers, and they're generally cherry picking from certain periods of US data, for example. But throwing all those numbers in a calculator, you can see that after 45 years, you would have £1 million in real terms. So that's inflation adjusted. That means £1 million in today's spending money. Your actual nominal value would be significantly higher than £1 million. So that's all well and good, but I'm not planning on waiting for 45 years. I'd like to achieve that target sooner. I'd like to try and speed it up. Now, this is obviously a double-edged sword because I can save and invest more and cut back on things now for future gratification. But at the same time, I don't want to miss out on living now, on doing things with friends and family, or not going on that holiday, or not doing X, Y, and Z because I'm delaying that gratification too much. Now, I'm naturally not a big spender. I get a lot of joy just from some of the simple things in life. A big favorite of mine is just sitting and reading a book. I could do that for hours and hours on end, really. But I'm not the only one that I need to consider in this target. I've got a wife, I might have kids in the future, and they don't necessarily want exactly the same things as me. They will have their own desires, their own wants, and so my target needs to incorporate that as well. So what is the plan? Well, I'm fortunate that I've always been a saver, and that's meant that since I finished university and started working, I've tended to save a decent chunk of my salary every month anyway. My first employer matched pension contributions were 7%, so I took full advantage of that, saving 14% of my income. I also saved like mad in the first few years out of uni to get a house deposit together, and probably lived my student lifestyle for quite a few years after university, just living on bare bones, which meant that I didn't really do much in terms of extravagant holidays and things like that. But it did meant that I had some money to put down for a deposit for a house, and that's meant that I've been able to like ease off as I've got a bit older. Now, I have shown that it's a really long road trying to get to £1 million just from sort of saving £500 a month. So there's 3 real levers that I see that you can pull. The first is to reduce your expenses. So just as a bit of a shock factor number, this number always sort of shocks me really when I hear it. But every £100 that I could save a month is £30,000 less that I would need to have saved and invested. The second lever that I've got is I can earn more. So I've pursued this a little bit in my job. So you can try and get promotions, you can try and negotiate higher pay, you can jump jobs. There's all kinds of things you can do to try and increase your salary. And I was able to increase mine by effectively doubling it in 6 years after I finished uni. But unfortunately, because of the environment that I work in, there isn't a huge amount of progression available after that. And I've actually also dropped self-employed, which has dramatically cut my earnings in the short term. And the third lever, perhaps maybe a more controversial one, is to look for better investment returns. So the example that I gave earlier with the 45 years was based on a 5% real return. But if you can get 1% more, a 6% real return, then that shaves 5 years off what you need. If you could go for a 10% real return, then that would shave 16 years off that 45 years. And so you can see there's quite a lot of tweaks and things that you can potentially, small differences would make a big change later down the line. Now, I'm less keen on cutting down expenses just because it means that I may have to miss out on things. And so that means I'm really concentrating on the second 2 levers, so earnings and returns. So the first thing is earnings. Now, as I gave with the mortgage example, a small source of extra earnings can have a big impact on portfolio requirements. So that's why you'll see on this channel, I've slowly been trying out a selection of sort of side income projects. I don't post them that frequently just because sometimes it takes a little while to actually try them out and give a good overview of what they're actually like. And I'll put the playlist down below as well. And I've had some good success with those. I've had 2 profitable, 1 unprofitable. And so my kind of rough target is if I can bring in £500 a month with very little effort. And so by that, I mean just maybe a couple of hours a week, maybe sit down one weekday evening at the computer for a couple of hours, and that might be all that's required. And if that can bring in £500 a month, well, that shaves 150 grand off my total target that I need. So again, that's another one of those kind of shock numbers where £500 a month doesn't necessarily sound like that much. But when you see that that equals £150,000 worth of portfolio value, you can see that actually if I could find something that brings that in consistently, it will make a massive difference to my target. Now, I will also just say that perhaps a side benefit of trying all these kind of little extra earners is that I've actually really enjoyed picking up all the new skills for those. Now, of the 3 that I've got shown on the screen here, the sports betting one was just a really simple trading time for money. So it wasn't really that much thought that needed to go into it. I could just sit myself down and exchange that time for money. I can't remember the exact hourly rate off the top of my head, but I think it was around £25, £30 an hour from my sort of trialing out is what I could get from that, which is pretty decent going. I then tried building websites, and that was my most profitable in terms of total amount of income that came out of it. But I didn't track my hours in that one, so it's maybe a little bit more difficult to compare. And it's also a much slower burner, but it was really hands off. I could leave that for months and months and literally do 0 hours on it, not do anything, because I had other people writing articles for me. And it was literally just people searching things online. They'd come across my website, see ads, I'd claim ad revenue. Great. So that was a really good business model back then. I'm not sure if I would do it now just because of the changes that we've seen, especially in sort of AI generated content and things like that. But again, you can see that video for a full breakdown of that. And then finally, there was the KDP, which is Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing, where you could publish books on Amazon. So I tried that out with some really sort of low content books and tried that for 3 months. Now I did actually end up losing money, but there is just this kind of very small recurring income in the background now that I literally just ignore. And every now and again, I get a little payment from Amazon, which is quite nice. Now, I would just say that if you do have the opportunity to maybe work a bit of extra overtime in your job, especially if it's paid at sort of 1.5 or double times, then that's a really good way to earn a little bit of extra money that you can funnel into investments. Again, the industry that I work in doesn't really offer that in the same way. There's sometimes a little bit of overtime that can be done, but it's definitely not sort of paid 1.5 and 2 times. And it's also generally has to be pre-agreed. And just the places that I've worked, that was quite difficult to get agreed. So it isn't necessarily an option for everyone, but earning more at your job can have much bigger impacts than small side incomes if that's the route you want to go down. So that second lever is the returns lever. And if you've watched this channel for a while, you'll be aware that when I started this journey, I posted monthly return videos showing what I was doing. Unfortunately, I have actually stopped doing those just because the nature of the investment choices that I'm making, which you may have gathered from the name of the channel being the Risk on Investor, are much higher risk than I think most people have the risk appetite for. So I did actually get quite a lot of sort of personal criticism from that. I've left up criticisms that are just about what I'm doing because I don't mind that. But more sort of personal comments, I just deleted off the videos, and that's why I've stopped doing those. Now, I have kept talking about it in my newsletter, and I've had a really positive feedback there. People emailing me with some encouragement or just giving me some thoughts, which I've really enjoyed that version of the feedback. And so I've generally been keeping that all on the newsletter. But here's just an example of why taking some high risk, short-term sort of attempts at making some extra money can have a really big impact. So I've plotted out 2 people here, one in the blue line, one in the red line. Let's say they've both been saving and investing for a little while and they've managed to get to £100,000 invested. Now, they're both invested in global index funds, getting 5% return per year. But the difference is that one of them takes 3 years, goes out investing specific companies or maybe spots a specific opportunity that plays out over the next 3 years. And that person gets 25% return for the first 3 years. And then just goes back to a global index fund at 5% per year. Now, those short-term high levels of return aren't necessarily out of the ordinary. You can get those if you keep your eye out, but to get them really consistently, I think is really difficult and next to impossible. And so that's why I focus on just getting them when I see the opportunities there. And you can see that if we then play the numbers out, that the person who found that 3 years of just one really good opportunity that played out over 3 years actually ended up 300 grand better off just from a couple of good decisions that they might have made really early on in their investing career. And so that's the general kind of framework that I follow with my approach to things. I'm happy to take the higher risk if I see the opportunity, especially while I'm much younger and can afford to take those risks. Now, when I'm looking to take those risks, I would say that there are a few things that I'm willing to do that some people aren't. So I'm willing to do some active stock picking. And I know that many people just kind of hear that and immediately switch off, which I do think is maybe missing some of the wood for the trees. The other thing that I'm happy to do that a lot of people aren't is I'm happy to take on leverage. So one book especially that changed my outlook on leverage, and I would really recommend it as a read, is Life Cycle Investing. And so whilst practically I think the examples laid out in the book aren't that achievable with the investment vehicles we have in the UK and the cost of capital environment that we have at the moment, the idea of taking leverage when you're younger, because it smooths out your sequence of return risk and also maximizes your chances of compounding, actually really resonated with me. And there's some really compelling numbers presented in that book which just demonstrate the benefits of taking leverage early and then deleveraging as you get older. Now, another core area I need to consider is the diversification. So Warren Buffett said in 1996 that diversification is a protection against ignorance. And there are a number of studies that suggest that beyond about 20 holdings in the stock market, your benefits from diversification drop off quite significantly. Now, my default position will be just to buy a global index fund, which is obviously going to hold thousands of positions rather than, say, 20. And that's because I don't have the time to just go out and do the level of research into every company, into different sectors that someone who's doing this full time would be. And the whole sort of underlying idea is that I don't want to be doing it full time. I want a portfolio that works for me. And so I'll also leave a link to one of my videos in the description below, which is about one of my favorite funds. And spoiler alert, it's a 1.5x leverage 60/40 fund, which gives you that 100% exposure to equities, whilst also giving you some lower correlated assets for the remaining 60%. But what about diversification outside the stock market? So one that appeals a lot is property, both physical residential property and commercial exposure through real estate investment trusts. Now, property has quite a high barrier to entry. A small terrace house near me will go for £250,000. So you're probably looking at £70,000 for a deposit, legals, and after net of management costs, insurance, mortgage, voids, maintenance, etc., you're probably looking at netting £300 after everything. And you'll notice that's actually slightly higher than the 4% return on capital I was assuming for a global portfolio, at around 5.1%, and that's excluding any capital appreciation, which you get leveraged exposure to as well. Now, of course, there'd be tax considerations to bear in mind, etc., that may change that 4% target. But if I could combine property with, say, a £500 per month extra side income, and the rest of the portfolio, because of property, was getting 5.1% return, my £1 million target becomes only 670k, which sounds a lot more achievable, shaving off sort of, over £300,000. And that could deliver £40,000 a year in income. So you can see that the path isn't really set. I'm actually someone who sits more in the camp that a global index fund won't help you build wealth effectively. It can help you build wealth, but it's not a particularly effective way of going about it. But it does help you keep it because it's so diversified. So I'm still trying out loads of different income opportunities to find out what might work for me for that £500 a month, especially looking at that kind of low effort side. Because as we've looked at in this video, £500 a month, if I look at the portfolio value for that, is worth 150 grand to me. So it's a big chunk of change just from finding something that actually maybe isn't the biggest earner, but is something that I can do on the side. And so I'm always open to ideas for that. There's a couple of things that I'm trying at the moment that some videos will slowly be coming out about over the next couple of months. But they do take a little while just to work through, just because I want to give them a proper shot. But if you've got any good ideas, I'm always open to them. Post them in the comments down below or hit reply on my newsletter if you're on the newsletter. And hopefully by sharing my experiences, you might find something that would work for you as well. Now, if you're on a similar journey, I will just do a bit of a self-plug here. You can hit the subscribe button below and be notified about more videos. But there's also a newsletter that I write once a week, which you can access if you go down to the links in the description below. And I give updates on my £1 million journey in that. I also just give some interesting news stories and other bits and pieces that I've stumbled across during the week, which I think you'll enjoy reading and learning about. It also gives me a chance to post some more analytical type things as well that aren't really that suited to YouTube. And I've had some really good feedback on that as well, so hopefully you'd appreciate it as well. Now, I'll leave some links in the description below for videos for the side income that I've been trying out, and also my favourite fund. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.